And let me start by saying thank you to all of you for taking the time to come out and participate in the democratic process. This really is on Afghanistan. This is a very tough issue. The more I learn about Afghanistan, the more I come to understand that it is a very, very challenging decision that the President has made with respect to his policy. And ultimately, when and if I'm called upon to vote on funding that strategy, the answers are difficult. I understand many people arrived here at 1:30, and so we've wasted a lot of people's time in this room. I apologize for that. There was a mix-up on the timing. So if we wasted your time, I do apologize for that, and thank you for being here. I don't start any day where I don't start by remembering that my title is representative. And that means I represent your points of view in the U.S. Congress. Now, you all have different points of view, so sometimes it's a little hard to figure out exactly what your points of view are, but it is my job to represent you in Congress. So with respect to Afghanistan, like on any other issue, I do a couple of things. On Afghanistan, I actually went there for a couple of days to see for myself, to talk to General McChrystal, to talk to President Karzai, to talk to the leadership about what was going on. I'm talking to the experts at places like the CSIS and the Council on Foreign Relations, all these places. But the most important thing I do is to hear from you. And this is now the fourth and final of 4 town halls that I have done on Afghanistan, and we always follow more or less the same format. I'll talk for 10, 12, 15 minutes max and give you my sense of kind of where things are there and some impressions on what is going on over there based on my visit. And then I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'm going to tell you right up front, I don't know what the answer is. I would hate to stand in front of you and say I want to hear your opinions, but I already know what I'm doing. I already know what my point of view is. The purpose of this is to gather your input, my constituents' input, so I can reflect that. You may get frustrated if you say, are you going to vote for the President's plan? I'm going to say, what do you want me to do? That's the purpose of these meetings. So I'll just give you kind of 10, 15 minutes on what I saw over there and what I'm hearing, and then feel free to ask questions. I'll try to answer them. I may not know the answer. Feel free to make comments. I don't have to answer questions. I really want to hear from you. I will ask, try to keep the discussion to Afghanistan. There's so many issues that we've been talking about, but I appreciate it if you keep it to Afghanistan and your opinions thereon. And I'll make a point. I've been there and thought about this enough to know that it is perfectly possible to have a principled and thoughtful and honest opinion that we ought to go with the President's plan. And it's perfectly possible to have a principled and thoughtful opinion that is exactly the reverse. It is really hard. And we should remember that as we sort of listen to people that we disagree with and whatnot on this very, very complicated issue. I will also make the point, if this were free, it would not be such a difficult choice. But we are talking about 2 things that are very precious to us. We're talking about the lives of our young men and women who are over there, which are priceless. We've lost 950 already in Afghanistan. November was the deadliest month we've had. And of course, it's very, very expensive in terms of dollars. The Congress has appropriated $68 billion for this year's activities in Afghanistan before the President's new strategy. The President's new strategy of sending an additional 30,000 troops will cost an additional $30 billion on top of that. So we're talking about $100 billion for the ongoing per year for the ongoing mission in Afghanistan. That is very, very substantial money in the context of a lot of debt that we're carrying and very substantial deficits. So in the spirit of understanding that this is a complicated issue, I'd like to provoke the crowd a little bit by saying this. If you stand up and say we need to spend the money for security reasons or for whatever reasons you articulate, that's fine. Like I said, I'm here to listen. I'd also appreciate it if you then say, and that $100 billion that it's going to cost should come from raising my taxes, adding to our debt, or how we're going to pay for it, because that's part of the equation. If you believe that we should withdraw entirely, that will obviously save some money, but it also opens the possibility for much less influence on our part in a very, very dangerous region in the world. So if you say let's withdraw, you better be comfortable with us having much less of a presence between the 2 most dangerous countries in the world, which are Iran and Pakistan. And if you're willing to address that, I'd appreciate it. So let me just spend a couple of minutes on kind of where we were and where we are on Afghanistan. And let me go back a ways to kind of when we all started paying a little bit of attention to the country which was 1979 when the Soviet Union invaded, to prop up a communist government that was faltering in Afghanistan. And it was a terrible mistake for the Soviet Union, partly because Afghanistan is a hard place to take over, but partly also because the United States mobilized very substantial resources to, ironically, work with a lot of the guys that we now see through the sights of our guns, these mujahideen, to eventually topple the Soviet effort. They lost about as many men in Afghanistan in 10 years as we lost in Vietnam. Very expensive, very brutal effort for them. They withdrew in 1989. Subsequent to 1989, the CIA predicted that the communist regime there would fall overnight. It actually lasted for about 3 years before it fell, and now we got the warlord government that basically rotated the presidency of Afghanistan, and it was just, corrupt, looting the country. People took turns looting Afghanistan. The Afghans lost faith in the government, and so now the Taliban is on the scene. Taliban comes from the word talib, which is the Pashto word for student. These were young, hardcore Islamic students, some of them, who offered an Islamic vision for the nation. They offered to root out corruption, and they took over. And then made the very severe error, of course, of sheltering al-Qaeda in the country, allowing terrorist training camps and other infrastructure to develop. This is when we really started paying attention on September 11th of 2001, when the attacks on New York and Washington, of course, originated out of al-Qaeda cells and infrastructure in Afghanistan, September of 2001. Shortly thereafter, late September, early October, the Bush administration gives the Taliban an ultimatum and says, you turn over the terrorists and you shut down the training camps verifiably, or in the memorable words of George W. Bush, you will suffer their fate. And again, they make the mistake of not doing so. And military operations begin in October using special ops and air power. We very quickly overthrow the Taliban in November of 2001. And a process begins that ultimately results in Karzai being the president, President Karzai. We have since then seen, to my way of thinking, and I suppose you could argue with me on this, we have seen a largely under-resourced effort in the country, both militarily and in terms of economic development, as we committed resources to Iraq. And predictably, the security situation has deteriorated very substantially. November, as I mentioned before, was the deadliest month for American troops in Afghanistan. The good news is, if there is good news, the good news is that actually development is occurring in Afghanistan. There are now 1 million more children in schools in Afghanistan now than there were a year ago. Schools are getting built. Kids are going to them. The ring road, which is so critical to communications in Afghanistan, is complete, though not secure. Cell phone service, traffic, this sort of thing. There is progress being made. And it's remarkable that it's being made because the security situation is very difficult. I'll share with you 2 impressions of being in Afghanistan. We met with everyone from General McChrystal to the ambassadors, right on down to 18-year-old Air Force kids that we had a couple of meals with. Everyone without exception on the American side and on the NATO side is excited, enthusiastic, and optimistic about what they can achieve there. I had one young guy tell me that for the first time in his life he feels like he's really doing something important. The military believes they can achieve their mission. USAID, that is doing things like building roads and putting up cell phone towers, are really excited about it. They see progress. On the flip side, and this was the other impression I got, was the security situation is tough. You cannot get out. These USAID guys cannot get out unless they are surrounded by very heavily armed military. We could not move as members of Congress without body armor and armored cars. We did not get to talk to a single man in the street because we couldn't go in the street. The security situation is very tough.